Um, Morning, everyone. I know many of you through my regular day job at Columbia Land Trust. So just to clarify, this is kind of a secondary role, and I'm speaking on behalf of the foundation this morning. So many of you are already familiar with the Weyerhaeuser Family Foundation. A number of you are, as community forests, are currently or have been supported by the foundation. And a number of you have been supported by the foundation through other initiatives besides community forests. The goal here today is to make sure that if you aren't yet familiar with the Weyerhaeuser Family Foundation, that you become so, and understand that the foundation wants to support your work related to sustainable forestry and community work. So this is just a slide from the Mount Adams Community Forest. This is unrelated, this isn't the Mount Adams Community Forest. This is Mount Adams Resource Stewards work that was funded by the foundation, unrelated to it. And we'll go through here just briefly some of the additional topics, or I should say, initiatives that the foundation wants to support. So go ahead, next slide, please. So the foundation has three giving initiatives, and one of them is the Sustainable Forests and Communities Initiative. The goal is to support the development of environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable communities in forested regions. So the Weyerhaeuser family has a connection, obviously, to forestry in the U.S. Historically, most of that connection was in the Pacific Northwest and in some of the northern Midwestern states. So historically, that's where the Family Foundation has focused its efforts. And next slide, please. This is just a bulleted list of some of the types of programs the foundation has funded in the past. And again, if you're not working in community forestry, or if your organization has initiatives outside of community forestry, consider the foundation as a potential supporter of your work. The foundation has a real emphasis on innovation in the realm of sustainable forestry. So a priority is supporting work related to ecosystem services, developing tools that monetize ecosystem services, working forest conservation, so community forests, or forest legacy, conservation easements, for example. A lot of landowner outreach related to healthy forest management information that can support landowners. Conservation finance tools, innovative conservation finance tools. Collaborative groups historically have been really important. And the last is forest restoration. Forest restoration is a priority when it's connected to that kind of classic triple bottom line component, where it's linked in with a community component and an economic component. So next, I'm just going to run through some case studies to give you a sense of the types of applications or the types of programs that the foundation is currently funding, just to give you a sense of the kind of work that you may have needs for and the foundation wants to support. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. What I wanted to say here is the foundation has a long history of supporting community forests. So back in 2008, put funding in on a early case study of a report on what community forests could look like in the West. As many of you know, this was a model that has some history of the eastern states, and there was a question, what does it look like in the West where there's different land tenure systems? So they wanted to support that work. And then in 2018, working with Sustainable Northwest and this group, put together an additional handbook of case studies about what community forests can look like. The reason I point these out is just to say the foundation feels really invested in the work you're doing. So you should feel like they want to support the work you're doing. All right, running down a list of these are just current programs. This isn't even getting into past programs. Working with the Chelan Douglas Land Trust. Aaron was here talking about Chelan Douglas's partnership with Chelan County Natural Resources Department to develop a management plan for the Nason Ridge Community Forest. The Nason Ridge Community Forest implementation was also supported by the foundation, and Western Rivers Conservancy's work on that prior to getting to the management planning phase. Connexu Land Trust out in Sandpoint, Idaho, has been developing a program to do outreach to the community to talk about what sustainable forestry looks like. And it's a pretty neat, small-scale community initiative to understand harvest and what kinds of wood products we can make at a community scale. And they supported a branding and a marketing campaign that Connexu put together. The Jefferson Land Trust, many of you are familiar with their, help me, what's the name of the ridge project? Chimicum, thank you. Similarly to Chelan Douglas, they wanted to put together a stewardship program. So the foundation supported their initial creation of a stewardship manager position. Go ahead, next. The Watershed Research and Training Center, in partnership with the Pacific Forest Trust, they're working down in the Trinity Headwaters Forest. The foundation is supporting both of those organizations with their really collaborative approach, where one organization has the on-the-ground experience, the other organization has the transactional experience to conserve the land. Both of those entities are being supported by the foundation, and the foundation loves that collaborative model where each entity is bringing the skills that it has to work together. And Washington Association of Land Trusts, Vanessa's here, has an awesome program to build support for Washington State funding programs and outreach to many community forests and land trusts to make sure that they're aware of state funding opportunities. And Whatcom Land Trust is using funding to develop a management plan as well. So you can see a lot of community forests are using funding for a stewardship focus. Some are also using it on the initial application phase. And Vanessa, if you get pictures in your next grant report, we can put them up here and we can have some awesome Walt photos too. Next slide. Just quickly, geographic focus. So again, historically, the foundation has worked in the Northwest and Northern Midwestern states. The foundation's in a process right now of reevaluating its priorities. Some of you may know there wasn't an open grant round this year. There's going to be new priorities along the lines of the things we're still talking about. They'll be announced this fall with a new grant round opening up in late winter, early spring of 2025. The geographic focus, I think I can say this, is going to expand. It's going to be broader than it has been historically, but there will still be a strong focus on the work being done here because it fits so well with that triple bottom line priority. Grant size, the average grant size right now is about $25,000 a year. What's different about the Weyerhaeuser Family Foundation is that they seek to fund programs over multiple years. So historically, they focused on a 3-year grant cycle. If you get funding that first year, you'll submit an additional, much condensed grant application in subsequent years, but they want to see initiatives get off the ground and continue to support them for the first couple of years until they can have a financial foundation of their own. Notably, if you look on the website, it'll say the foundation doesn't support land acquisitions. That can be confusing, so I want to clarify. What they don't support is the actual purchase of the land. So that $25,000 can't buy fee title, but it can support your staff salaries for doing the transaction side of the work, or obviously management planning after the fact. I think that's what I got. Again, the goal is to make sure that you feel comfortable reaching out to the foundation. I didn't put my email up here. If you've got a pen, my email is madronanate@gmail.com. You can email me anytime. You can also go to Columbia Land Trust website and find me there. Send me an email, no problem. Yeah, Erica.
That listed as one of the things that Weyerhaeuser offering, or
Sure.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was, can I speak about the creative financing tools that was listed as one of the categories of activity that the foundation seeks to fund? Again, they're really interested in innovation. So I think they're looking for models that organizations have that can enable land conservation, monetization of ecosystem services, all in the vein of promoting more sustainable permanent forestry, with that triple bottom line focus. So examples have been the New England Forest Foundation in the past was working with Sustainable Northwest to develop a model that allowed small forest landowners to conserve their land, enter into a co-op type of structure. Yeah, we could talk about that.
Yeah.
But if you have ideas on that, the foundation wants to hear about them. That's probably the hardest category of all. Community forests are great because they're straightforward, they're easy to evaluate, they're easy to understand, they're great to get behind. But if you have some creative notions, like bring it forward. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
All right, and last but not least, from our partner presentations, I have the honor to introduce John Rose with the Washington Opportunity Fund. You also get and Patty Cook. I only do what they tell me on the paper. And also John. You have the best shoes.
Yes, we don't have a PowerPoint, we have handouts, we're old school. This might have to do with a conversation I had with our 10-year-old granddaughter the other day. She was speaking poorly of old people, and I asked her the definition of old. She cited a year that, let us just say that Patty and I passed a while ago. And then I asked her what makes old people different. And she said, and I quote, "Old people don't understand electricity." So anyway, Patty, you're supposed to come up here. You're requirement. Well, actually, wow. Do you have a tall and thin button? I'm actually wearing two hats here. One of the reasons why I borrowed Daniel's, because I have the great privilege of being the chairman of the board of Sustainable Northwest. And it's really thrilling today to me hear how many times the word Sustainable Northwest come up, because I think we do a really good job of hiding our light beneath a bushel basket. We're really proud of the forestry work we're doing. We're also really engaged in regenerative ranching. We're also engaged in clean energy. But in the forestry world, I think people in this room know some of what we're doing. Forest collaboration, working on things like the Arch Cave, working on things like forest collaboration of the Colville National Forest. We're just about to announce a major agreement to help the tribe manage the lands in the Fremont Waneema. And I think it's appropriate for me to give a special shout out to our staff. Daniel's here, Greg's here, Evan's here, Steve's here. They're the ones who do the work that allow us to stand up and say we're really proud to be part of the organization. So thanks, guys. So that's one hat I wear. But the other hat that Patty and I would wear, we need hats. We don't have hats. Is we are the co-founders of something called the Washington Opportunity Fund, which is designed to provide short-term bridge financing to land trusts or other nonprofits who are trying to acquire environmentally sensitive lands and need to get money now. A willing buyer, willing seller, know where the money's going to come from, but need to close before the money can get there. That's where we step in. So we got into this. I was on the board of the Washington chapter of the Nature Conservancy for, I think, 18 years, for a long time. But when I finally got term limited off, I realized that work that the Nature Conservancy had been doing when we originally got involved, the work of acquiring sensitive lands, ecological lands, had now been passed on to the land trusts in the state of Washington. I think the 39 of them, ranging in size from big to small all over the state. But they're the ones that were doing that place-based work that had been so attractive to Patty and I when we first got involved. So we set about to think about what could we do to help those groups accomplish this sort of thing. And we created the Washington Opportunity Fund. It's a fund administered by the Community Foundation of North Central Washington. It's using money that have been donated by a number of generous donors, and we're up to $1.7 million that have been put into the fund, designed to provide the short-term bridge financing. What we're trying to do is provide a source of financing that is fast, simple, and cheap. And what I'd like to do is tell you about the terms of the loans, the criteria we use to decide who we're willing to lend money to, the process we use to make decisions about who gets the money. And after I've described all that, You can decide if we're really fast, simple, and cheap. And then Patty's going to tell you about some of the successes. We're pretty proud. We've made 4 loans already. We've got a 5th in the hopper. When we started this thing, we didn't know if there'd be any market for what we're doing. And it looks like we've got proof of concept. So the terms of the loan. Loans of up to $500,000. Loans with a 3-year term. 1% interest paid annually. And no collateral. So when we talk about these things, people usually ask questions about 2 of those terms. Why 1% interest? Why bother? Why not make it 0? Well, the answer is we want people to remember this is a loan. It's not a grant. We expect it to be repaid. And it's important to have it repaid because it's once repaid, it goes back in the fund. It's going to be eligible for somebody else to get bridge loan, what they're doing. So that's why the 1% interest. And the second is why no collateral. Well, we're not a commercial bank. If I was a commercial bank, I'd want collateral on these things, but we're not. If somebody fails to pay the loan, we don't want the land back. We wouldn't know what to do with it. And we decided that rather than make our loans based on a piece of hard land that we might get back if you don't pay it, we're going to make it because we trust the people who are doing these projects. We trust all of you in the room. And if something goes wrong, nothing bad's going to happen to you after 3 years. We don't get your firstborn. I don't want your firstborn. But it stays on your balance sheet, and it's going to be an obstacle to doing things in the future. So we think the goodwill, the good faith, the good work of the people we're lending money to is worth more than any collateral we might ask for. So our criteria have evolved over a little bit more than a year we've been doing this. The first one is it has to be for the acquisition of a piece of land with ecological significance. So a lot of the projects we've been working on have a recreational benefit. And that's great. We're not against recreation, but that's not why we're doing this. We're doing it for ecologically sensitive lands. Now, our definition of what that means has had to evolve. One of the first projects we did was to acquire a piece of land that had been thoroughly clear-cut. Norm Johnson has tried to teach me that the biodiversity on a recently created open space is pretty great. Well, that's fine, but this thing looked really ugly. So we were standing there looking at it, and then our science advisor, Peter Dunwoody, who at first was saying, oh God, this looks terrible, then turned to us and said, it looks terrible now, but if you do this 100 years from now, people are really going to be grateful that you did. So it's got to have ecological value. The second criteria is it's necessary to have our money to close the deal. If you don't get our loan, you can't close it. So the standard deal is someone's wanted a piece of land. They got a willing seller. They've got a real purchase and sale agreement. They think they know where the money's going to come from to complete the transaction, but they need cash now. That's where we come in. So this has been the criteria, which has been the one that has caused us to turn down a couple of loan applications. When you apply for our loan, we're going to ask for your balance sheet. Twice now we've looked at balance sheets and said, we don't think you need our money to close this deal. We know why you want our money. It's fast, simple, and cheap. Did I mention that? Fast, simple, and cheap. But we want to make loans where without our loan, transactions simply can't close. Third criteria is there needs to be a credible plan for repaying the loan. Not collateral, but a plan. A grant that you're pretty confident you're going to get. A philanthropic donation that you're pretty confident you're going to get. A capital campaign that you have reason to think will succeed. We need a credible plan because, did I mention this? This is a loan. We want it to get repaid so we can put the money back to use. And the fourth criteria is there are lots of land trusts and nonprofits in Washington that are doing this kind of work, but they vary a lot in terms of their level of experience, their financial wherewithal, the kind of community they're in. What we're really after, what we really favor is the smaller land trusts, where we're going to be encouraging to up their game, to be more ambitious, take on more risk. That's really what we want to do. We want to take this game and work in communities where it maybe has not worked before. So our process is you go to the website of the Community Foundation of North Central Washington, and you'll find a preliminary loan application form. Pretty straightforward. What are you trying to buy? What's the status of the transaction? How much do you need to borrow? What reason do you have to think you might be able to repay the loan? Pretty basic stuff. And then we have a committee that will review that and get back to you and say, if we think we're interested. The committee's got some names on it that I think people in this room will recognize. Remember, this money is housed in the Community Foundation of North Central Washington. So technically and really, they are the lender, and their executive director, Beth Stipe, is in charge, and she's absolutely terrific. But she gets advice from a group that includes me and Patty. It includes Kurt Soper, who many in this room will know, used to be running the Chelan Douglas Land Trust. Tim Seifert, who used to run the San Juan Preservation Trust. Peter Dunwitty, who's a biologist we met when he was working for the Nature Conservancy. And Owen Wozniak of the Land Trust Alliance. We'll look at this and say, yeah, we think this passes muster, or alternatively doesn't, and invite a final application. And we think, assuming there's good communication, from the time you submit that preliminary application to the time we get back to you, will be about 3 weeks. So I hope you agree with me that we've set up something that is fast, simple, and cheap. And the exciting news is there appears to be a market for this. We've had some projects that Patty's going to tell you about.
Hi, so it's a pleasure to be here. I love hanging out with people who are doing conservation work. And thank you for doing the work. So we've been at this for about 2 years. We've made 4 loans and we're in the process of making a 5th. 2 of them have to do with community forests. The others are, different type of transaction. The first loan we made was to the Skagit Land Trust. They bought a piece of land, 68 acres, bordering Big Rock, which is a small county park. That park was it's not developed and it was not accessible to people because there was just no way to get to it. So we were able to help them. They were in the process of making another large land purchase when this land became available. So they didn't have funding for both projects. So that's why we decided we wanted to help them. This land connects with other Skagit Land Trust properties in the Nukachamps drainage. It has a lot of local significance. People love Big Rock, and it has significance to the Upper Skagit tribe culturally. And it's the one that's been severely logged. The second loan that we made was on the other side of the state, a place called Glentana. This is an old dairy farm with also uplands. The Northwest Land Conservancy had been trying for years to buy this, and the heirs were having problems agreeing about what to do, but they finally decided that they wanted to sell. The Northwest Land Conservancy went so far as to get a bank loan for part of this, and we were very impressed that they were really putting themselves out there to try to buy this property. It's over 1,000 acres with 2 miles of frontage on the Little Spokane River. The Spokane tribe is doing some salmon reintroduction there, which is really exciting and fascinating. There's some cougar habitat. It's an exciting project close to the city of Spokane and bordering on State Park. The third project, which was a very small piece of land, I think it was less than 5 acres, and it was up in Whatcom County, up by Blaine in the California Creek estuary. Whatcom Land Trust. This piece of land came for sale. It had a house on it, so it was the kind of thing that somebody might want for a vacation property, but it was something that would connect the conservation work that they've been doing there for wildfowl habitat, and also to improve the drainage that goes into the saltwater right there. There's oyster farming going on out there and fishing. So we were able to make a loan to them. And then this next one, I'm standing here looking at Jay. I think most of you probably know more about this project than I do, but it was to the Mount Adams Resource Stewards to add to their community forest in the Convoy Tract. 800 acres, yeah. And I haven't been there yet. I visited all these other places, but I would like to come see what's going on. I was looking at your website yesterday and enjoying reading about the bobcats you were seeing on the property. And then we're currently working on another project, which hopefully will become a community forest. And it's in a remote part of the state in Washington, a tiny land trust, which has never purchased land before. And they're hoping to purchase a 1,200 acre farm, and it will have forest, cross-country skiing, trails, there's a wetland, there's some farming going on. It's a really exciting project. I hope we'll be able to do it. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years. If you have ideas, we'd love to talk with you. I can't resist saying that we're also trying to raise more money to put into this fund. So if you know generous donors, we would love to talk with them. So hope you'll spread the word, and we'd like to know if you have any questions.
Patty, I don't want to put any pressure on anybody who's borrowed money from the fund, but have a couple of these loans been repaid?
Two of the loans have been paid. Skagit did a capital fund, and they were very successful and repaid the loan. And Northwest Land Conservancy has repaid 2/3 to 3/4 of what they've borrowed. So that's good. We have that money back to loan.
Any questions? Yes, sir. In the way back.
Can you repeat that question?
The question is, think outside of Washington. Well, getting on the board of Sustainable Northwest forced me to confront the possibility that across the Columbia River, there was beauty and love of culture. And I've had a lot of fun learning about Oregon, but the answer is no. We're about Washington. In my work at Sustainable Northwest, I've encouraged my fellow board members to say, we think this is a good idea. Maybe somebody in Oregon wants to do this. And if you know somebody in Oregon, have anybody interested in it, we'd be glad to share them what we've learned. But we're narrow-minded on this topic. Mark, is there?
Sorry. Does he call it?
What about sketch?
I'd say yes. Now let me warn you, the first application we ever received, which we turned down, was from someone who said that if we would give them $500,000, they would create a nonprofit and try to find a project. That was potential. We turned that one down. Yes, I think we would. And the story of Skagit is a good one. If you just look at it, it looks really ugly, but it had all kinds of potential. So I think the answer is yes. More questions? Well, thank you all. Oh, we got one.
Too many qualified applications, turning down loan applications that you would otherwise like to launch. In other words, the demand exceeding.
At the moment, we have money available to lend. We've taken in 1.7 million from a variety of donors. We've lent out a bunch of that. Someone's come back. So at the moment, we could fund probably 2 loans. We expect some more to be repaid. We're seeking more funding because we have the sense that the demand is just sort of starting. But at the moment, we got money to lend. The door is open. But, you know, if you call me up and say, if I give you $500,000, I'll create a nonprofit, and then I might find a project. It's not that open. Thank you very much.
So what I heard is you'd have more money to lend if Jay would pay you back. That's kind of. We're gonna take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have our final panel of the forum. panel, which now I've already forgotten the title, so Jay, you'll tell them the title too. Like I'm getting fast and loose as MC at this point. What is it?
I don't know the title.
Would you like-
Yeah, the title?
Financing to increase the pace and scale of community forests in the Pacific Northwest.
Increasing the pace and scale of community forest finance, increasing the pace and scale of community forest acquisitions in the Pacific Northwest, something like that. We okay? Can you hear me okay? Is it? I did. Is that any better? Yeah. Okay. We still have some people here. Now running for the doors in on this beautiful day. Thanks for that very brief, thanks for keeping it brief, just an introduction. I know we've already made an effort to thank our sponsors, but I wanted to make a couple of other recognitions. I want to point out the executive committee of the Northwest Community Forest Coalition. If you're on the executive or steering committee, raise your hand. So you're the people that get together on calls pretty much monthly, if not every couple of weeks throughout the year to do our best to put these kinds of conversations together. And if it's something that you feel incredibly passionate about or interested in engaging with us on, talk to Daniel. And we've got a process. Also want to call Daniel out. Daniel is the one that herds us cats. Tries to keep things sane and moving in a constructive direction. So really appreciate Daniel and Sustainable Northwest's support for that. I know we've called them out as sponsors, but Nils, huge thanks to you and everyone here in Wallowa County. Yeah, I've been throwing encouragement through the years to get us over here. It's a long way to go, but I think everybody would agree, it's worth every mile of road between here and Portland or Bellingham or Seattle or wherever you hail from. So really appreciate it, Nils. For those of you that don't really know me, I mean, Wallowa County and Nils's work here with Wallowa Resources has long been kind of a North Star for me and my organization. I interned here back in 2001, and whether you want to call it community-based forestry, community-based natural resource management, or community-based conservation, I don't think there's anybody that really does it better than you guys down here in this beautiful corner of the state. So thank you. Nils also helped me to put together this panel. So I'll try to get through a few remarks here. I did want to share a short little story. I'm not a good storyteller, but I'll try. Getting at this idea of a community forest finance panel. The irony is, God, about 15 years ago, when I've got 3 kids, 2 of them are grown up off of college. When they were about 4 and 6, I was on a family vacation. Parents had a condo, we had a condo. Parents were like, go out have a date night, we'll take the kids. Come back a few hours later, kids are in their pajamas, pick them up, take them to our condo. What'd you guys do with Grandpa? He taught us about compounding interest rates. What? He taught us about banks and interest. And I looked at my dad and I said, Dad, they're 4 and 6. Is this what you want to do with your precious time with your grandkids? Like, in this curmudgeonly way. We know about you in finance. So there's some irony in that I'm here trying to organize a panel on finance, community forest finance, and then scratching. In past years, we've had a community forest funding panel, and really it was focused on kind of the tried and true programs and strategies that have been used to acquire community forests. We've had presentations from incredibly important programs and partners, as you just heard from, or may recall from past years, publicly funded grant programs such as the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Program that came about in the 2008 Farm Bill. And it's made a huge difference for many of us in our projects. The Washington RCO Community Forest Program, which came together thanks to a lot of efforts from folks in this room a few years ago. Loan options we've discussed in past years that were typically heavier to what we call bridge loans, small and large, from the Washington Opportunity Fund that we just heard about, that in addition to what's it, simple, fast, cheap, I would add friendly. how many loan programs you close on and they get invited to their house for dinner? And it couldn't have been an easier, more friendly process and experience for us to work with. Craftery has presented on past panels. Northwest Farm Credit, I don't think anybody has used them, but at a very early community forest
They're
forum.
not called Ag West.
I know they're called Ag West. To the year, Mark Walther from the Redwood Forest Foundation shared their journey of borrowing literally millions, tens of millions of dollars to make the Usalt Forest Project happen. People like Peter Stein from Lime Timber and Bettina von Hagen from EcoTrust Forest Management have presented in the past, where they shared partnership stories where they served as bridge investors. Tom Tuckman, who was on our executive committee for years, shared the concept and dream of community forest bonds and what they potentially could leverage for our community efforts. We had foundation reps. Thanks, Dave, for being here. Weyerhaeuser Family Foundation has always been a wonderful supporter and sponsor on that capacity side. And we've had, let's see, one year we had the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust back when Kit Gillen was there, that has actually supported capital campaigns to raise funds to acquire lands. So like I said, those are the kind of the tried and true things we've discussed in the past. But what really motivated me to moderate this panel about finance that I don't know much about is I believe we're still falling short. And to Nils' question yesterday about funding community forests when there isn't a high conservation value salmon stream, or let's say an iconic Oregon land feature like the East Moraine. You know, many of our community forest interests may seem uninspiring at first glance. It may just be, rolling hills of second growth forest, patches of stumps, maybe recent clear cuts. They've got their warts, whether they're rife with road systems that may be in various states of disrepair or noxious weeds, the odd eroded seasonal stream channel. They're not going to land on the front cover of any glossy conservation publication, maybe. But they're critical to our communities, to land-based livelihoods, to our connections and sense of place, as Steve Rigdon so beautifully described it yesterday. And they're in need of the restoration and rejuvenation that will come with generations of reinvestment and stewardship that I feel strongly communities and tribes are best positioned to lead. So ultimately, I was motivated to want to moderate this panel because I feel passionately that it's essential that we not rest with the funding successes we've had, and that we continue pushing ourselves to innovate around ways to more directly and rapidly and efficiently access bolder financial mechanisms that can empower communities to own and steward the lands we depend on and that most directly impact our day-to-day lives. So to drive that point home, another little story. Our first acquisition was back in 2011. We like to try to pat ourselves on the back and say, first nonprofit-owned working community forest in Washington, all 100 acres of it. And then yesterday, we went out on 1,800 acres. And I tried to join the group, but it was pretty exciting. It was pretty exciting to come to the realization as I scrambled all over that moraine, that property was big enough to actually never hear you, ever see you. And you guys did it in one effort, one punch. It took us 6 different transactions to get to basically the same size you guys did in one. So that's progress, that's success. But it started with that 100-acre project that you could literally yell across and hear somebody on the other side of a pond. It's true that with the time between each of these acquisitions, in our case, there's more gray hair, maybe less hair. Community institutions and businesses deteriorate or they just flat out fold, and generations in our community sometimes choose to move away. So we first started a community dialogue around community forests in what we call the South Mount Adams region in 2003, after a 110,000 acre tree farm that had really been central to our communities changed hands twice in 2 years. And since 2000, part of that tree farm has now changed hands as many as 8 times. So you do the math in terms of average length of ownership. These are lands where forests, as remarkable as they are, don't grow as fast as they do on the wetter side of the Cascades. We talk about a biological growth rate of around 2% a year. Yet each one of those investors has been able to generate returns closer to somewhere in the 5 to 8% range for their investors. And we've had rumors of a couple that were in the 10 to 15% return range. It's driven by harvest rates that are more aggressive and rotation lengths that are shorter than these lands supported under historic industrial management tied to sustaining log supply for local mills. Near-term revenue generation potential is thereby diminished for subsequent timberland owners and investors, which turns our focus to the other significant piece that generates returns for the investor, which is what we call the exit. Both pricing lands higher than they were bought for, even though timber stocks are lower, and driving conversion sales, what we'll call HBU sales, often of what are referred to as non-strategic lands. And the cycle repeats, and it repeats again. And the resource is too often impoverished. And all that happens while the price to buy the land the next time continues to increase. Local property taxes increase based on comparison sales, challenging community affordability. You have fragmentation of resource lands and wildfire-prone forests, where you just have another externalization of a cost that's borne by the taxpayer when it comes time to put a big fire out that's burning toward expensive homes. You have degraded wildlife habitat. We could go on and on as far as the challenges. But ultimately is what this panel about is why do community forests, or maybe I should put it this way. I think one of the challenges as we were putting this panel together was the need to make as concisely as I can a statement as to why community forests versus other conservation approaches deserve continued, if not increased attention relative to funding. And so I would argue that they stop that, the sale and resale. Not that other conservation approaches don't, but these do. They stretch limited conservation dollars potentially by realizing value associated with timber asset management, as we heard in the mirror example. $7 million transaction had $4 million in grant funds, access $3 million in timber value through a harvest. I'd argue that working community forests in communities with a history of natural resource-based economies are more likely to support a level of forest management that can service debt than traditional conservation models. I think there's an argument around better fostering an enduring model of conservation by engaging and empowering people closest to the resource to manage. It's a model based in inclusion and power sharing, where community, as we've discussed in past forums, is not just geographic, but also a community of interest. And in my mind, it's participatory democracy at its finest, where consensus is essential in a time where our national and state and regional politics are often being frayed at the polls. So I'd argue that because of this, community forests are an exciting follow the hedge. We want to talk about long-term social and political viability around our resource lands and conservation. Community forests further create that fourth ownership class that Mills was describing in his opening remarks, that really strive to achieve things where other ownership models fall short. So a few questions I shared with panelists to keep in the back of their mind as they prepare their remarks. Where are there opportunities for innovation and different approaches? How can we access larger buckets of finance? How can we access more patient capital? Are there opportunities to more directly and efficiently connect the mythical, I call it mythical, some people call it mythical, many millions of dollars of impact capital to place-based investment strategies in community forests that could potentially do a better job of honoring and advancing community priorities and values? I think we've got a great group to explore that. Really, really appreciative of all of you. We've got one more online, Reggie Hall with Legacy Works. I'm going to do their bios right before each one of them goes. So first up, we've got Spencer Shadewell. And Spencer is a co-founder of Alder Point Capital Management that invests in impact-oriented U.S. farmland and timberland assets. He was previously in a CFO role at Heartwood Biomass. If somebody who visited this morning bright and early, a forest restoration focused forest products manufacturing business here in Wallowa County. And before returning to Wallowa County, he spent 7 years investing in farmland and timberland for a large, impact-focused U.S. family office investment firm in San Francisco. And most importantly, he understands finance. So, Spencer. Great.
All right, and I live here now, and it's great to grow up in Eastern Oregon, the Grand. Going to Mira before it was Mira's, or on those roads sledding down them, so it's fun to go back and see it now. So thank you, Josh, for that. So Alder Point Capital is a new fund, they're a new firm that two of my co-founders and I just founded this last 2 years, where we're actively raising money to do similar work to what we did, the three of us, for about a decade together at this large family office. It was 100% impact focused while trying to prove that you can also deliver 100% commercial returns. We managed about $2 billion and we put about $300 million to work directly in farmland and forest land with a focus on conservation and regenerative practices. And so an example of deals we've done in the past is in Southern Humboldt County in California and Northern Mendocino, right on that county line. Over 24 transactions, reassembled 15,000 acres in a very fragmented watershed with a lot of coho habitat, other important resources. So spent a lot of time with 23 transactions to stitch that watershed back together. And every couple thousand acres, we do a conservation easement with one of many land trusts, some really small organizations right at our fence gate, or Save the Redwoods League or North Coast Regional Land Trust. So as we started reaggregating the watershed, doing easements in chunks that felt bite-sized or palatable or right-sized for actually executing. Did carbon projects and other things on that property as well, and then reorienting the silviculture for some really undermanaged or poorly managed properties that were part of that fragmentation. So that's similar to this, an example of the type of work we've done in the past and what we're looking to do now with our new firm. But instead of managing money for a single family, we're raising money of a lot of different investors and foundations that are partnering with us. So that's a quick background. We go to the first slide here. And this sort of bottom-up framing that I have here on the slide is how we think about an asset and how we encourage other folks to think about it, which is starting from the left of what is the asset, what are the attributes, what are your management goals, desired future conditions, all the management planning that everyone hears far better than I am and really thinking through. But then moving to, okay, recognizing where you want this property to go and what the resources are on this property, what tools are available to generate cash. And that's either return of capital, which I'll cover on the next slide in terms of types of tools, or income from the property, and both near term and long term for that specific asset, given its attributes and what you want to do with it. And then lastly, now that you know what tools are available and what the near and long-term cash flow potential is of the property, what capital structure can you right size to those tools that are available to you? And so we'll go sort of through the spectrum of how I think of the capital structure from the most expensive to the cheapest or freest. So that's just sort of a framing of this. I think I've seen, and I think others probably have examples where if you start with what type of capital is available, it's on the right, and then you try to back into servicing that capital or returning that capital to if it's expecting a return, you start impairing what the thing on the left, what your desired future conditions are. So an example of this is taking on a lot of commercial debt, and because that's what was available to get this community forest done. And then you have to hammer the forest to service that debt because maybe you have a carbon project on it, but back in the day when credits were $10 a ton, that wasn't servicing your debt. You have to start harvesting a lot more aggressively than you wanted to. And that's a trade-off that you have to think about making. Maybe that was your only option on the capital structure side, but that's just sort of a framework or lens that I'm wanting to introduce to the conversation. I think we're going to hear from the other panelists very specific examples of what capital structures are available. And then I always think about, okay, how do you service that? What tools do you have available on your property? So we can go to the next slide. And I think Jay already alluded to this on the right. I've kind of got this, what I think of as community forests having one hand or maybe both hands at times tied behind your back. And so when you're an investor, a commercial investor in timberland, like Jay said, you you're thinking about exit, your ability to someday sell that property. In my past experience, we were at a family office that could think multi-generational, so we could own an asset for many decades if we wanted to, or we could look at selling it if we thought that was appropriate, or if we could have an aligned exit with an impact owner or a community forest, for example. But if you're buying this and you're the end of the road, you're finally the musical chairs that Jay was describing is stopping, where the asset isn't turning over and over. And we had in our backyard here in this county, a property sell 2 times over in 12 months recently, which is pretty wild to see that sort of almost double escrow process of churning very quickly. But if you don't have exit available, when you think about, and I have an appendix slide we could pull up in Q&A, but a financial model where you're looking to generate an internal rate of return, a lot of the return comes from the exit, the ability to sell the property. It's appreciated in value. Maybe you genuinely improve the value of the property, or you're just benefiting from more capital formation, more money chasing, fewer acres. So if that's not available, that's a real challenge, I think, in taking that tool off the table. And then the other one on the right in the circle is management intensity. And we've talked about that and looked at that of, you know, if you don't want to continue the even age management that an industrial managed property has had in the past, and you're trying to do a different type of silviculture that frankly doesn't generate as quickly near-term cash flows for your property, that's a real trade-off. So those are real challenges. I think the tools I just put on the left here, I think always from like a finance lens of, is it generating net income or is it reducing your cost basis? And basically what I mean by that is, we bought a property for $10 million and did a conservation easement and returned 50 to 60% of our cost basis, got 50 to 60% of our money back by selling the development rights effectively and some other encumbrances on the asset. Or we've seen carbon projects, and Mick spoke about those a bit yesterday, but where we've been able to return half the cost basis from an initial issuance of carbon credits. So those sort of at the bottom there are examples of how you reduce your cost basis, kind of what you've put into the ground, potentially relatively quickly within 3 to 5 years. And then the top 3 tools are more on annual net income from the property that's generating sort of that recurring cash flow, being timber, carbon, and recreation of 3 here. And the bullet points here are just identifying again where it can start to sometimes feel like your hands getting tied back a little bit in terms of timber income. We talked about if you're not as aggressively managing to maximize cash yield from timber. Carbon, there's growing disparity between compliance and voluntary markets that we could talk about. And there's also sort of less appetite or charisma or feel good about the initial flush of credits that I was just talking about in terms of getting paid on day one for a lot of carbon that's there. And we could get into that debate for sure. And then recreation, that could be a potential source of income, but that may be in conflict with the idea of free public access that community forests can really benefit a community with. So that's I think a tension that folks like Josh probably think about in terms of, well, could we pay for could we charge for parking at least to start paying for some infrastructure on the asset? But these are sort of how I think about the tools and then the overlaying that with the lens of community forests and what tools might still be available. And then almost lastly, your next slide is that sort of third part of that first slide of what's the capital structure. And this is sort of the spectrum I think about of your most expensive on the top here of commercial return seeking equity, sort of if you think about TMOs or other commercial investors that are investing in equity ownership of timberland and looking for a real return there, all the way down to what's free at the bottom, and maybe one step up from being free is what John Rose would call the fast, friendly, and cheap. And here you're getting invited to dinner, the second down from the bottom, and up here on the commercial debt, you're committing that first child, I think. So that's spread on the spectrum there. But Jay was alluding to, how do we get access to the big, I would simplistically, this sort of second column on scale, there's a lot more money that's interested in US timberland that is expecting a commercial return. And then there's a lot less money that's free or fast and cheap and friendly. And so how can you blend these, or can you really get into the higher parts of this table? And what are the trade-offs? And maybe there's an opportunity to start blending this where you're not fully capitalizing a community forest with commercial return maximizing equity, but if you have lower cost or free cost of capital blended in there. Maybe there's a potential with the easements, with some of the tools we talked about, easements, carbon, timber cash flows, that could return the capital to a lender or to an equity investor and a return on top of that return of capital. So that whether it's 3 to 5% or 5 to 10% more expensive capital, there's a potential there. But I think this is, I'm just sort of naming, I think the challenges the community forests frankly face by not having as many tools. And so then lastly, I'll just go to a couple of open questions that I'd love to talk with folks about on this next slide here, which is just, you know, again, how can community forests compete with industrial or commercial focused investors, especially in today's high valuation environments? On the west side in Washington, you know, we're seeing more than $6,000 an acre properties transact, and even DNR is, I mean, paying that. It's not just TMO's paying that kind of money, but that's really expensive timberland that's shocking to me. And so how do you compete with that if you don't have the same tools available? Second one being that if there aren't enough tools available there. And so what are the benefits that community forests have? They have access to that cheaper or free capital that others don't. And so can you use that as a tool that others don't have to compete for that expensive ground or compete with others that have a tool like exit in part of their financial return analysis? And then lastly, I think lots of these previous biennial forums, as Jay mentioned, have talked about bridge owners where investor capital is sort of impact focused investment funds can play a bridge role. And I've got lots of thoughts on sort of what are the enabling conditions where that makes sense, or where is it, frankly, and this is sort of the last bit in orange, they're just a middleman capturing margin and, you know, it's just costing more at the end of the day, but is that worth the trade-off of them giving you 10 years to do it? Or I think a benefit of to use a pejorative word, middleman in this sense is like the roll-up strategy I was describing, where an investment firm might have the $40 million it takes to restitch together 15,000 acres over a lot of transactions over a lot of time, do the easements, do a carbon project, reduce that cost basis so that when it sells, it's actually selling for less than what was originally put into it to assemble, and a long period of time for the community forest to ultimately own it. We've done that also in farmland where we bought farms in the upper Midwest that we leased to a Hmong American Farmers Association, a nonprofit working with Hmong American farmers in the Twin Cities, giving them a clear path, 10 years to work to ultimately buy out the property, which they did in 9 years. But we're more creative structures where or fourth generation organic farmers are building equity in an asset over time and taking up. So there are lots of creative things I think we've seen more in ag and timberland, but I think there's potential there. So I think I'll just stop there, and that was a bit of a tee up, I think, for folks that will get into more specifics, less out of just abstract discussion.
Well, thank you, Spencer. That was perfect. And so next up, we've got Reggie Hall joining us remotely, I hope. Reggie, there you are. Good. Met Reggie. Well, Reggie, I kind of think you owe me on this one, right? Because I both borrowed money from you and I served on one of your panels once.
Yeah.
So he currently serves as the director of conservation finance for Legacy Works Group, a nonprofit impact consultant and asset manager. He previously developed and led the Conservation Fund's highly successful conservation loan program, from which we once borrowed, where he facilitated several hundred loans that provided almost $250 million in financing that was used by local partners to complete conservation projects in 40 states and 5 Canadian provinces. He's also worked with agency partners and others to conserve several 100,000 acres thus far in his career. Reggie, wish you could be here with us in person, but really appreciate you joining remotely, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Jay. And yeah, greetings from the wood basket at the other side of the country, based out of a home office here in New Hampshire. And dearly wish I could be with you all today, but unfortunately couldn't figure out a way to teleport travel-wise. So anyway, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and hopefully this works out. Does that work? Can you see that in the room there, Jay? I'll assume yes. You're on mute. So anyway, so Legacy Works, we're a nonprofit, as Jay said, impact consultant and asset manager, and we work across the U.S. and Mexico to lead and support community and landscape scale initiatives. We also create shared infrastructure and systems like data dashboards, support organizations, and also this conservation loan collaborative that I'm going to tell you more about. So, generally speaking, we believe that the future of conservation and working landscapes in America is increasingly local and no longer in the hands of the large national organizations. And as a community, I wish I could have been there for the whole gathering, but I'm guessing it came up. As a community, we're at an inflection point in that there is more public agency money for conservation and working landscapes than ever before, but it is frequently not readily available. If you've got a transaction that is relying on federal funding, that could take years to close, and landowners and sellers are rarely that patient. So, conservation and community organizations need ready access to act when priority opportunities arise. But unfortunately, over the last several years, the amount and availability of bridge capital specifically for conservation has actually decreased. And so to address that gap, and thanks to support from a coalition of foundations, we just completed the design phase and are preparing to launch this conservation loan collaborative. And so we're actually on, in that last slide that Spencer showed that showed the spectrum of returns, we're targeting and creating a tool and an on-ramp to tap into the lower cost of capital at the bottom of his spectrum there. And so the design of the collaborative pairs the power of a fund manager with the knowledge and networks of local organizations, regional partnerships, and funders in order to launch and grow a wide range of revolving loan funds to mobilize and deploy catalytic capital at concessionary rates. So to be clear, we aren't launching a single large fund, but rather are creating the systems, support, and services that organizations and funders need in order to find each other, collaborate, and create the revolving funds that they need to accelerate and achieve mission objectives and conservation outcomes. So visualizing it, and this was not planned, we've always visualized this collaborative and the financing platform that's part of it as a tree. So I think this metaphor will hopefully land with this crowd. But so what we're creating and launching is that platform down below where it's the shared system structure, services support, from feasibility studies on launching a revolving loan fund to actual fund management, cultivation of investors, impact reporting, underwriting of loans, storytelling and marketing, regulatory compliance, all of those things to support the creation of revolving loan funds that will be managed and created by the communities and organizations that need that capital. So we're already working with 10 different revolving loan funds representing single organizations with a programmatic or topical focus to regional partnerships of land trusts coming together to create a regional or local revolving loan fund. And then we're also working with some other partners and foundations to actually create like a national kind of catch-all revolving loan fund. And so the core actors in the system, and running with the tree analogy, the fruiting bodies are really the borrowers with the projects, that pipeline of need. So it's land trust, tribes, agencies, community organizations, you name it. Really no limit to the types of projects that could be financed. And then the leafing bodies, or the clusters of leaves, those are the revolving fund teams. And I'll explain a little bit more about who those are, but those are effectively the communities that come together to create the revolving fund for their use. We're represented, Legacy Works is represented by the trunk, the branches, the root systems, and providing the support and the staff and the service to link the projects and the pipeline of need with the investors and donors and funders, i.e. the nutrients there in the soil. And in particular, we're really excited about creating the on-ramp, the easy button, if you will, for supporters of conservation, for supporters of community forests, those major donors that are writing $5,000 and $10,000 and maybe $25,000 checks. Those individuals and those family offices and funders, they could probably lend $100,000 or $200,000 or $500,000. And so we're creating that vehicle for them to support conservation in a different way, instead of just donating to it, actually investing in it. So how revolving funds are formed. Each community or each revolving fund designates a fund team. So that for a regional partnership, for instance, that could be the executive directors that are coming together to create a regional revolving loan fund for their use. It could be the tribal council if we're working with a tribe or an indigenous community on a rematriation or land back project. It could be an individual organization that wants to create a revolving fund to advance their mission. So again, the fund team comes together. We work with the partners to create the loan committee, set the terms, work to identify the early funders and investors in the fund, and then launch it and help to manage it. And then the donors and investors, those funders, come together, engage, and invest in the fund. What we're seeing so far is that the early funds coming onto the platform and into individual revolving funds so far are philanthropic, so grant money, zero cost. In some instances, we're seeing recoverable grants come onto the platform. Some of our funds that we're working with are also beginning to entertain program-related investments. So, how funds operate on the platform, it's a simple revolving fund. Dollars go into a particular revolving loan fund. We work with the revolving fund team to find projects and loan and need, deploy that capital through low-cost loans. The goal here is to provide financing, interim capital at the lowest cost possible. So, ideally in this market, maybe 50% of prime or less. So that would be like 4%, hopefully less. It all depends on, the flavor of capital going into a revolving fund. So if it's zero cost capital, grant money, recoverable grants, low PRIs, then obviously those funds could be lent out at a much lower rate. So projects, loans get deployed, loans get repaid, technical assistance provided to the borrower, working with the fund team, working with our team of experts, capital recycles and moves on to the next project. And what we're also beginning to see is that funds that we're beginning to manage are also beginning to explore opportunities to co-finance each other's project where there's overlap. So for instance, in this fictitious example, there could be a community forest project that is pulling money from a national kind of overarching fund. You could be creating, your community could be creating a programmatic, like specific community forest fund for your state, for your community, for your coalition. We're also working with some foundations and individual funders that have their own vision for how they want to deploy their capital. If there's overlap, whether it's a community forest that has bird habitat and the funders care about birds or water quality, whatever the opportunity is. And then also there could be a regional Pacific Northwest Conservation Fund, whether, we're partnering with Craft 3 to deploy their loan capital to land trusts or, working with CDFIs elsewhere, really an opportunity to kind of leverage each other's dollars and flavors of capital to make conservation happen. So with that, Jay, I will curtail my remarks. I could ramble and I love this topic and can't wait to get into discussion.
Wow, thank you, Reggie. That was very exciting. I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well. So next up, we've got Erica Lindholm. Erica has 2 decades of experience working with community development financial institutions, including the last decade with Craft 3, first as a senior underwriter and then a senior business lender. As an underwriter, she underwrote Craft 3's Conservation Bridge Fund loans, and as a lender, she led on conservation loans in Washington State. After medical leave in 2023, she's returned to work part-time as a contractor to Craft 3 to work on the Watershed Conservation Fund pilot project, which she will tell you more about in a moment. So welcome.
You, Jay. Thank you, everybody. It's so exciting to be here. I'm also wanted to mention that I also serve on I'm from Port Angeles and serve on the board of the North Olympic Land Trust. And so I am, you know, reeling from all the stuff that we're learning here, both as somebody who's excited to be partnering and financing these projects, as well as somebody who is like Nolt hat on and thinking about ways we can use these resources. So, and I want to, part of my medical leave, my eyesight is really bad now. So I might have to move out of this. I might have to get closer actually to see so I hope you'll bear with me a little bit here. So, let's just go to the first slide. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of Craft 3, just to make sure we're all grounded in what we have done, you know, what we do, and then history of the Conservation Bridge Fund. But I really want to focus on the Watershed Conservation Fund pilot, which I think is what you guys are all here to hear about. And I'm excited to tell you that you all are the first ones publicly to hear about this, because we just got the okay to talk about it on Friday, I think. So next slide. So Craft 3 founded in 1994 in the middle of the timber wars in Ilwaco, Washington. So our roots are rural and all about you know, balancing economy and conservation. And so that's our origination, but we've grown over the last couple of decades to serve both the full two-state region, and we have employees across the 2 states in rural and urban communities. And we are a CDFI certified by the Treasury as a community development financial institution. That certification is just a certification that means that banks can get CRA credit for investing in us, and doesn't mean anything about regulations. We are not regulated and we can take more risk as a result. Next slide. So our funding comes from a broad, different range of sources. I think at last count, it was 120 plus different sources of capital. So, but they're all expecting something from us, either impact benefit or some kind of return, modest mostly, but nonetheless a return. But these are categorized, our sources of capital are probably in 3 main buckets, all mission aligned to a certain degree. Let's see, yeah, grants and donations who are looking for, you know, those impact benefits, mission aligned investors, including banks who loan us unsecured capital, but expect a certain amount of return, and community impact investment notes, which are typically accredited investors who are also lending to us unsecured so that we can re-lend those dollars into community. Next slide. So the Conservation Bridge Fund is, so Craft 3 does a whole bunch of different stuff, you know, lending to small businesses. We have a consumer loan product side. We lend to nonprofits for, you know, anything from housing to childcare to, you know, so, but conservation is a you know, big element of what we do as well. And the Conservation Bridge Fund was founded in 2011 with a large PRI, program related investment, for Meyer Memorial Trust that for loans in Oregon originally. And since then, we have loaned 39 loans over $31 million, conserved 19,000 plus acres, and leveraged over $60 million in private investment. So, and that's in both states. We, a lot less lending in Washington because we haven't had that Meyer Memorial Trust capital. But we've been able to piece together sources, in Washington periodically to achieve the lower interest rates that we, need to make these conservation projects happen in certain cases. But we're constantly looking for new ways to make these projects feasible, and low, meaning finding lower cost of capital. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So next slide. So what we're finding as we've done this work over time is, you know, these projects are getting larger and larger. They, you know, both from a standpoint of, you know, what's becoming available to acquire and what needs to get acquired to be protected, as well as the borrower entities that are looking to do these projects are getting more and more sophisticated. So they're able to handle larger transactions. So we're seeing larger transactions. Tribal partnerships are more often a component of these projects. You know, hopefully, you know, eventually the tribal ownership becoming a goal of the project, or at the very least advising on the project themselves or participating in the management of the properties. Because of the scale and the complexity of these deals, we have found we need multiple lenders, not just Craft Re. I mean, and we welcome that, because many times there, with multiple sources of capital, we can, from different sources, we can bring the cost to the borrower down. However, that increases the complexity, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Alternative sources of repayment when we first started the bridge fund, we were mostly looking at just, you know, bridging, you know, 1 to 2 grants or something for the project, or bridging to a sale to DNR or the Forest Service or something. But now there are so many different sources of capital needed to make these projects pencil. And sometimes they're not all going to be taken, the project can't be fully funded by just grant sources. So there needs to be thoughts for longer term sources that I think Spencer talked a little bit about. Next slide. So just an example of how this complexity plays out and how Craft Re is trying to, it has worked to simplify for the borrower a little bit and bring down the cost of capital with this complexity. This is an example that is sort of a simplified version of some of the projects we've done recently. And I think John actually, Washington Opportunity Fund was involved in a structure somewhat like this, so maybe a little bit outside of this. So an example here is the property needing to be acquired was $7 million. Land Trust has $3 million, needs to borrow $4 million. But our cost of capital, or, you know, our interest rate on in Washington State right now is roughly 6.5%. So we don't want the $4 million borrowed at 6.5% to make this project happen. It couldn't happen that way. But we sometimes have a connection, or the land trust that's borrowing has donors / people who are supportive of their land trust that want to loan to the project at a very reduced rate, but they don't really have experience in doing, you know, executing loans. So they'll participate in a loan with Craft Re. In this case, we have an example of a $1 million lender and a $500,000 lender. The $1 million lender is lending at 3%, the 500 at 0.5%. And when we have them participate into our loan, one loan to the land trust at $4 million, so rather than 3 loans to the land trust, there's one loan, and that $4 million at a blended rate of all those 3 lenders, Craft 3 now being at 2.5 instead of 4 million. The blended rate is at 4.8%. And Craft 3 can service the loan, help with underwriting, to the extent that the private lenders want to do their due diligence. We share all of that information. We negotiate a payment waterfall. So, however, in one case, where we had a similar situation on a loan I last worked on, the private lender, even though he was at a lower interest rate, needed a certain amount of capital paid down, first so that he could become liquid to do something else. We did that, allowed him to get the first payment. And then thereafter, the payments were split pari passu. There's also, we can work out the payment structures as needed to make the project work for both the lenders and the borrower, is what I'm trying to say. And this this makes the project work out and is a little bit simpler for the land trust and brings the cost of capital down to the project. So that's the key points are, Craft 3's goal is to make these projects work, and get the capital cost to the borrower down as far as possible. We want to simplify the projects, make them as easy as possible. So anything that we can do to, help streamline things for the borrower is a priority for us. And we've even, in some cases, when private investors want to participate this way, but they're not sure, they're like, maybe I'm going to forgive some of my principal in the long run. That's great, no problem. We can still, having them work through us, if that's what seems to be the best for the project and the land trust or the community forest, the borrower, that is a-okay with us. We all of our loans are crafted for triple bottom line results. That's where our name comes from, and that's what we're about, is crafting these loans to make them work. So, next slide. So what you guys have been waiting for. As you can see by the complexity and what we do to sort of makes ourselves into pretzels to get these projects done, we are constantly looking to innovate and figure out different ways to access capital and get that to the projects to have these conservation impacts as well as the other impacts that we care about. But I'm talking about conservation today. So, and before, what's not on this slide is a big thank you to the Department of Ecology, Washington Department of Ecology, Jefferson Land Trust, and Columbia Land Trust. First and foremost, Washington Ecology, they reached out to Craft 3 a couple years ago saying, you guys have figured out how in your consumer products to use the state revolving loan fund, which is the clean water state revolving SRF dollars, which is EPA money that comes through the states and is for non-point source pollution for clean water. And Craft 3, working with counties across Washington state, has accessed those dollars. The counties SRF is available only to government agencies and tribes. And so the counties apply for the dollars and then give the, basically move the, appropriate the money to Craft 3, who then lends to residences consumers who have residences with failing septic systems. And thereby clean their septic systems, helping the water quality in those counties. And so that's been a successful program for over a decade now. And Washington Ecology said, hey, we're getting all this money for green infrastructure with the SRF fund, and we can't figure out how to get this money out the door. Why don't you help us? And let's figure out a way to create a product that will work in a similar fashion to the consumer clean water product. And so that Niggler by Washington Ecology, PRAF3 went to found a county that Jefferson County is on the Olympic Peninsula, and I had connections there. And they said, hey, if we can help pilot a program that will be available statewide eventually, we know that's a good thing. And Columbia Land Trust was able to say, hey, we've got a lot of work in the Grays watershed, which is a TMD, a 303D watershed, and we know that conservation is a big component of improving those waters and cleaning those waters. So we can make the case that for a pilot that this if we figure out a way to get the money intermediary to PRAF3 and have it loaned to Columbia Land Trust for acquisition, we can prove this concept. So Jefferson County and Columbia Land Trust went for an allocation of $10 million with $500 million Centennial Funds grants, and then said, okay, Ecology, issue an RFP for a financial institution to run this pilot. PRAF3 and Sustainable Northwest and Washington Association of Land Trusts, Walt, we together applied, made a case for how we're going to, basically do a pilot loan in the Grays or multiple loans in the Grays watershed, and do a lot of extra work to figure out if this can be made into a statewide program. And we were just announced as the apparent successful bidder last week. And so we're off to the races. You guys are the first to hear about it. So the goal is to create a statewide program. And if feasible, we will then apply with other partners. It might need to be multiple counties. It might need to, we're not exactly sure what that process will look like, but the target is to get there and make another application to capitalize a statewide fund by the fall of 2025. Next slide. So the challenges and opportunities, though, here this is government money. This is EPA dollars originally and administered by the State Department of Ecology. So the great news is that if we can access this money, it is really cheap capital over a very long period of time with 20-year payback. PRAF3's sources of capital are typically we have our asset and liabilities have to be matched, and we are, generally our longest term capital is 10 years, but it's, I think on average, like 6. So our bridge loans are usually 3 years or they do extend longer than that, but we usually start with 3 years. But with this fund, with this money, we would be able to look at paybacks over up to 20 years. And then the current administration has funded SRF dollars to record levels. So, I mean, that's part of why Ecology reached out to us saying, we've got all this money from the, IRA infrastructure legislation that clean water funds were exploding with these dollars, and we need to figure out how to get them out the door. And also right now, up to 25% of these loans can be forgivable on green infrastructure projects. That's huge, right? So think about 25% of your, you get a loan for $10 million and you only have to pay back 7.5. It's pretty awesome. You've got 2.5 of your fundraising done already. So, but the challenges that we're going to have to work through with this pilot include, well, first and foremost, the challenge to using the money is that in order to get it to the people who are doing the work, which is you guys and land trusts across the 2-state region, you need a financial intermediary, because right now, only, as I said before, government and tribes are the only ones who access SRF dollars. And then the eligibility piece is a big question for us is, we have to prove water quality benefit. So our projects that we both need to demonstrate that the acquisition is for a impaired watershed, and we have to demonstrate, and we're not sure what level of demonstration is going to be necessary. That's part of what needs to be worked out. But if we need to make the case that the conservation is going to improve water quality. There's extensive due diligence required for each transaction. And so, that adds cost and time. And we want to figure out how we're going to be able to streamline that as part of this pilot. A water quality deed of right is going to be required on all properties that borrow from this fund. And that is a deed of right to ecology. We're not sure exactly what that means, and we have to learn, but we do expect that that's going to have impact on the property value, which could impact loan to value ratios, and could also, create conflicts with applying for additional grant funds. I think you need a waiver of retroactivity in many cases when you're applying for grants. If you have already, protected the property by having borrowed these funds, does that impair your ability to get more grant funds to pay it off? So, and then the fact that, these funds do come from the federal government, and the bulk of them do. They require a state match, but funding availability is going to fluctuate, I think, depending on who's in office, and it also the interest rates will vary over time. But generally speaking, they are always going to be a lot lower than the general market. So next slide. Our timeline on our proposed timeline still to be negotiated with ecology as we go under contract. Let's see, we're starting in July. We're going to have our first round of focus groups where we're going to be talking to folks like you to figure out what are the challenges in accessing this money and how can we overcome those challenges. And by starting right away, we'll be working with Columbia Land Trust on, deploying the capital in a pilot loan in the Grays River watershed. We hope to have all of that funding deployed by the end of the year, so that we can learn from that experience, learn from the process of going through the due diligence process, the water quality of right process, and help us educate, help become educated on what those steps mean to, to actually getting a transaction completed and how feasible or unfeasible it is. At the end of, fourth quarter 2024, Sustainable Northwest is going to help us with a watershed water quality inventory to help us determine how many watersheds would qualify for this project, for these funds. And thereby help us determine how much impact are we gonna be able to have? And then, oh yes, in also second quarter of 2025, we will be having the second round of focus groups with you folks after we've been able to sort of piece together a preliminary product design and say this is what we think it's going to look like, and how does this sound? Do we solve the challenges that we came up with in the first round? And then in the third quarter of, very importantly, also at that time, about the second quarter, mid-year of 2025, we'll be reaching out to folks, different borrower groups with the help of Sustainable Northwest and WALT to find out, now that we know what this product is going to be looking like, what are the technical assistance needs that are going to be required to help you guys apply for this money. And that will be part of our ask for further capitalizing the program. So we want to learn, we don't think that this is going to be the super easy cheap money and hopefully it'll be cheap, but it won't be super easy. And so we want to learn what's going to be involved and how we can address those things with some technical assistance support. And then we'll have a demand survey by that third quarter of 2025, and we'll be reaching out to all of you and all sorts of different borrowers, land trusts, tribes, small municipalities, maybe that don't have the capacity to go through apply to the state directly for the SRF dollars. We'll be asking, how likely, what are your projects in your pipeline? How likely are you to access this money? And that demand survey, we hope, will demonstrate that with everything else that we've done. The water quality inventory will make us be able to quantify what we need to go for a statewide application. And so October of 2025 will be our application to capitalize the statewide program. And because these are SRF dollars and on government timelines, that means that the earliest we'd be open for business is third quarter of 2026. But I hope that, I haven't poo-pooed things too much by mentioning the challenges, but what I think this can really, with the volume of capital that this could represent, and the inexpensive nature of the money and the long-term nature of the money, I think could really transform watershed conservation in Washington State, at least. And we hope that this would set an example that could then be used in Oregon and other places. So we'll be coming to you with, we'll be wanting to ask you, what your challenges are in financing your projects right now. What are the opportunities you see in using these dollars? Can you participate in a focus group? And do you have projects that we would consider for this money? So please reach out to us. Please, next slide is our contact information. Brad would have loved to be here, but he's on the Owyhee River right now, and lucky duck. And my contact information, you won't find me on the Craft 3 website right now because I'm just contracting at this point, but you can reach out to me there, and Brad as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. That was inspiring, and it really wasn't up until almost a week ago that we knew we have the green light for you to be able to share that kind of groundbreaking news. And so for those of you that are new to this conversation, this whole idea of patient capital in this example, potentially 20-year loans. If you're doing forestry and actively managing forest, all of a sudden that's a potential source of capital that then could also align with, not quite, but almost the rates at which forests grow and regrow, and how we can implement silvicultural prescriptions that could contribute to water quality considerations. So super, super exciting. And I know when I first caught wind of this, somebody said, go check out the Washington Clean Water Atlas, I think it's called. You go online and you can pull up a map and zoom into your area and see if there are 303 delisted or TMDL restricted segments of streams that might make you eligible to be part of that conversation, at least at some point.
Right.
So next up, we've got, and not least, last but not least, Kayla Swanson. And Kayla, really appreciate your willingness to jump in here and talk about some exciting work that you're doing with the Conservation Fund. Kayla joined the Conservation Fund in 2022 as the Columbia Gorge Program Manager, where she supports the Working Forest Fund and its management of the 35,000 acre Columbia Gorge Forest in my backyard. And she also works with the fund's conservation acquisition program for partner-driven conservation efforts in Oregon and Washington. Kayla's work in forest conservation is focused on building climate and economic resilience, developing management approaches to meet community and environmental needs. And her previous work was as the Forest Program Director at Sustainable Northwest, centered on community forestry, collaborative process, and policy development. So thanks, Kayla.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. In full confession, I've been traveling for the last 2 weeks, so I wish, looking at some of these beautiful slides and the diagrams, I think I could have broken this out a little bit better for you all, but I hope we can cover some good ground. And if you've got questions, happy to follow up. So I want to talk a little bit about how the Conservation Fund might be a part of your strategy for increasing the pace and scale of community forests. I think yesterday when folks were asking about, or even today, what are the tools that might be available for protecting working lands that have a conservation value, but where the conservation value is maybe, not the priority as much as the economic outcomes. And so Conservation Fund actually has a dual charter. We have a dual mission in both economic and environmental benefit. And we do believe that land protection in itself is a conservation benefit. And we always want to elevate all of the many benefits that land provides, but one of them is economic. And so I think this tool might be one to learn a little bit more about. So Conservation Fund, oh, sorry, next slide, Danielle. Thank you. We work in all 50 states. Since our founding in 1985, I think we've protected about 9 million acres. We are an accredited land trust, but not in a typical way because we don't own and manage land in perpetuity. We support a bridge rule and a bridge period. With our own capital, we can help support some of these complicated real estate deals and protect land for our partners and their priorities. We really do rely on our partners to bring us opportunities and the challenges that come with land conservation. We're really well suited to buy time and deliver land and water outcomes with you. So on the next slide, you can see, I think it is 9 million, sorry for the typo there. I'll just mention that we have many programs at the Conservation Fund. The Working Forest Fund is kind of inside baseball term. I mean, we're one organization and we have a revolving loan of a revolving fund, not a revolving loan fund, of $150 million. Within that, there's a conservation loan program. There's a Working Farms Fund where we work with first generation farmers, urban areas to create new connectivity and access. We also have a resourceful communities program that's really focused on resourceful or community led organizations and resources. And we have an urban parks program. So if you want to hear more about any of those, I'm happy to talk about them outside of this presentation. Today, we will focus on the Working Farms Fund. Next slide. So as you all know, working forests are vital to our nation's economy as well as to the health and the health of our wildlife and the ecosystem services that forests provide, clean water, air, climate, societal benefits. Fragmentation is a huge issue. I think that the statistic we had was that 50 million acres of private working forests were projected to be fragmented or converted by 2030, a date that's really fast approaching, and we feel like that threat is real. So in 2009, the Working Forest Fund was developed as an investment tool to ensure that forest lands remain intact into the future. Go to the next slide. This is an illustration from Maine. It is a little bit outdated, but the reason is that it's the sort of career span of Brian Dangler, who started the Working Forest Fund. And Maine is a really strong example of the change that we have seen in land ownership. We had on the left in the red, that was all integrated forest companies where you had, family-owned companies that had forest land that were managing maybe for sustainable yield because they're thinking about mills and forest products into the future and the generations of folks to come in their families. A lot of places used to look like Maine, but it's changed as we have structures like timber investment management organizations and real estate investment trusts. That's, money from Wall Street and venture capitalism to connect with timber ownership and management. So you see the slow progression of a change in ownership all the way to the right, where we only have one company, I think, in the picture on the far right that's an integrated forest company. You see folks who used to be owners and loggers who are now participating in investment. Fragmentation continues today. Every time a property is sold, it's broken up into smaller and smaller parcels. If we could update this map past, I think, 2009 to post-COVID, where we've got off-grid home development and tiny homes in the forest where you can work remotely and do anything that you'd like and bring your salary with you, we would see even smaller parcels and a lot more fragmentation. So that's why the Working Forest Fund is here, or one of your many tools. Next slide. This is just a general, go to the next one, sorry. General illustration of what we just talked about. So this is the model for the Working Forest Fund. We acquire a forest, we develop a sustainable management plan. All of our forests are either SFI certified or FSC certified. We work with a forest operations. We have a forest operations team. We also work with local contractors to develop a management plan while we own it. We're typically harvesting timber during our ownership so that we can buy down the value of the cost of, the time for our money to be invested in the property, but also we try to do revenue sharing and buy down the cost of the land for our partners when they ultimately acquire it. So it's responsibly managed forest during our ownership. And then we are looking for permanent protection or permanent conservation outcomes. And when we say that, we might mean a working forest conservation easement that protects the land as intact, and then we could sell it back on the open market. That's one possible outcome, but we really look for partners like Mount Adams Resource Stewards, like Oregon Department of Forestry, like Columbia Land Trust, City of the Dalles, who are going to permanently own and manage that land. So that, applying for that funding can take time, figuring out that strategy can take time, but that is, that's really the outcome that we want to see. So we conserve the property and then ultimately we resell or permanently protect it. And I think the piece that Jay wanted me to focus on was really how do we buy the forest? So I'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. I'll just mention the Working Forest Fund has protected, I think we've just hit our 1 million acre mark with 685,000 acres, owned in fee and then, permanently protected, where it has left our books and moved into permanent protection. There's 352,000 acres that we're still working to complete. So that's, just full disclosure. We've called it 1 million, but we're still finishing those projects. 43 total projects in all of the major timber regions, and we have a diversified portfolio. So how do we do that? Well, we have a mix of different funding sources. We work with our own revolving fund. We also have access to a green bond that we issued at $150 million. And then we also work with PRIs, program related investments, and private philanthropy. And so, what is the mix is different in every project, but we do have those resources available to bring to the table. And the criteria for working with the Working Forest Fund, it does vary. Every project is different. I didn't know the story of Craft. That was the motto, but we are always, working very closely with our partners to figure out how to make an acquisition work. In general, though, I think the Working Forest Fund projects tend to be 10,000 acres or more, and they tend to cost $10 million or more. We can hold those properties for as little time as you'd like, but the maximum tends to be about 10 years. So that's the Working Forest Fund. The Conservation Acquisitions Program, we can work on smaller properties. It tends to have a shorter hold period of 3 years or less. And all of this, having this mix of financial resources helps us figure out what our rate will be. We typically talk about a 5% interest on our projects over time. Maybe we'll go to the next slide and talk about the green bond. So the green bond, we worked in 2019 to issue the green bond, $150 million in total. I think there's about 125 million currently deployed. There are 12 to 20 bondholders at any moment. And a minimum of $1 million must be invested in each project if we're going to use it at all. So that's kind of how it gets mixed in internally. For the green bond itself, you can see this mix of projects is where it's currently invested, but as we buy or sell out of a project, where it goes changes. So this is current. We're actually missing one, I think, in Deep River Woods, maybe Washington, which is a new project, one in Red Hills, Alabama, and then another one in Barnard, Maine. For the bond, I think people got really excited about it, and it is a really interesting tool. I think working through the conservation funds, working forest fund feels maybe like a more accessible route than issuing your own bond, depending on the scale of a project. You don't usually want to issue a bond for less than $100 million, which might mean that you need 200 million in equity. And because we have that internal revolving loan fund, that's how we're able to get there. So it's not, but it's harder to access, I think, independently. There's also a lot of work associated with issuing a bond and then maintaining it. So we have reporting requirements. There's a third party called Sustainalytics that verifies that we're using a green bond. And so that's actually why we keep these records. We have a report or a methodology from Sustainalytics and the kind of reporting that we do with them. I brought a copy in paper if folks want to look at that. But then we also have to do a public facing green bond report and demonstrate all the environmental benefits of doing the conservation work that we're doing, which is usually fairly straightforward because that's what we're here for initially, but it does require that kind of reporting. So all that work for issuance certification and then bond ratings, maintaining our debt to asset ratio and thinking about where we can take on new debt. While it is wonderful to have this tool, it's also somewhat limiting over time because you can't take on more debt. So it sort of set the terms for growth in the organization in some ways. I'll stop there with the green bond and maybe just mention, if we want to go to the next slide, Deep River Woods was a 20,000 acre acquisition we just worked on in partnership with Washington Department of Natural Resources, where they really wanted to deploy they wanted to meet some of the targets set in the Climate Commitment Act and also deploy some of the funding that was associated with that. So they purchased 9,000 acres while Conservation Funds Working Forest Fund purchased 11,000 acres, and the total project cost was about $110 million. So that's an example where we use the green bond to help with our mix in purchasing that property. DNR will buy us out over time. We hope they have an option agreement to do so, and I think that is the full intention, so long as the Climate Commitment Act stays in place, as you all talked about already. If you want to go to the next, this is actually just the breakout of where the property is. It's in Pacific and Wahkiakum counties, near Longview or Cathlamet, Washington, if you know that area. And the blocks in red are the pieces that Working Forest Fund still has in its management, and the blocks in green are the ones that DNR initially purchased. Also really important salmon area, marble murrelet habitat. DNR has adjacent ownership right there, so it really kind of fits into this ownership structure already. And then I just wanted to say one little, since I love community forests and that's why we're all here. I don't have an example right now, I don't think, where the Working Forest Fund has developed or supported the development of a community forest project. A conservation fund has worked on community forest projects. So I will tell you just briefly about McIntosh Seed, which it's McIntosh County or McIntosh, Georgia in Long County. So that's where the name comes from. The seed part is Sustainable Environment and Economic Development. It's a nonprofit, community-based organization. They acquired 1,100 acres of land to create the state's first community forest, but it's also the first Black-owned community forest in the United States. And through the educational work that it does on site, it really aims to amplify the voices of Black and brown landowners in the conservation movement and to create sustainable forestry to achieve racial justice and climate resilience outcomes. So they do a lot of education and workshop and trainings. It's very community-centered nonprofit in general, and the community forest aspect is a mirror of that. If we go to the next slide. This is just a couple pictures, again, from the organization and the work that they do. And I wanted to give you their definition of a community forest, which is a community forest is a working forest that is permanently protected, offering the community value and benefits from the land, access and rights to the forest resources, and involvement in decision-making. In a series of surveys, focus groups, and interviews, residents emphasized the love of nature and outdoor recreational opportunities, as well as the need for economic growth through jobs and small locally owned businesses. So that's what I've got for now. Happy to take some questions and talk more with this group.
All right, let's open this up for questions. Thank you all for sticking with us this long. And hopefully that stimulated some questions or comments or anybody got anything you want to throw out there?
So this is a question for Reggie with Legacy Works Group. I'm curious, it sounds like you're playing a connector role and facilitating the development of these regional or statewide revolving loan funds. I was curious if you could speak to, I guess, the status of capital. If there are, do you have investors in sort of on standby that would be sort of ready to jump when opportunities for developing these revolving loan funds emerge?
Yeah, so we're it's an exciting time in that we're building the plane while we're flying it, and meanwhile passengers are getting on and off. Exciting times. So yeah, we've got a number of revolving funds that we're currently working with to create. One is active. Currently they've got $5 million that we're helping them to deploy to actually acquire fisheries quota and hold it in trust. So it's kind of like a working, like a community forest or a forest access or a farmland access program, but for fisheries. And then we also have a network and a Rolodex of impact investors, family offices, foundations, et cetera, that we've worked with historically. Legacy Works was founded by a guy named Carl Palmer, who founded Beartooth Capital 20 years ago, one of the first impact investment funds. So between he and I and some others on the team, we've got pretty robust Rolodex. So we're working on a number of like one-off projects that need bridge financing, but don't necessarily have a revolving fund behind them. So to answer your question, yes, we've got funding and kind of like on call and like a database of matchmaking ability, and we're trying to like create the system and process so it's a little easier for projects with need to find the funding, and for also to have the easy button so that if organizations have supporters or donors or other, you know, funding in their orbit or their geography, to like engage them and easily bring them on. So you don't have to spend $400,000 or $500,000 and do your own $100 million bond. You can bring them on through the platform to access their capital.
Thanks for all your presentations, really interesting information. My question's about scale, and I think it's mostly to you, Keola. I heard you say that the working forest program has a minimum of 10,000 acres to acquire properties. But then you also mentioned that through other programs, you've done, the organization has worked with community forests, with the Georgia example you gave. Do you see a lot of opportunity for the community forest level, like the working forest, as Nils mentioned, and you know, is such an important thing for community scale. And so, let's see, let me get to the actual question. Most of what I'm hearing of the examples are like lower 3,000 acres or 1,000 acres or 800 acres. So do you see a lot of opportunity, a lot of overlap with the work that you do for community forests, or is that through a different program? And how does your group work on that level?
Ayola, can you repeat
Oh,
the
sure.
gist of that question?
Yep, thank you for the question. The question was how the Working Forest Fund, which works at a scale of potentially 5 to 10,000 acres or more, can support community forests, which what we've heard about, I think maybe the largest we've heard about today was 3,000 acres. And so, is it actually compatible? And I think that's a great question. It's worth mentioning, we do have other programs like the Conservation Acquisitions Program that can work to support smaller transactions. But I think when we're talking about a forested landscape and trying to maintain that integrity and the community forest being a part of that, scale, if you're thinking about working lands and timber revenue as a primary objective or as the main objective, you might want a larger landscape to really help the forest pay for itself. We're also thinking about recreation, and we're thinking about habitat, and we're thinking that there are many reasons you can have a community forest. So that's also where when the Working Forest Fund buys a property that is large, like we did in the Columbia Gorge, there's 35,000 acres, but there are 13 out sales planned for that property. And so a community forest could be one of those. It doesn't have to be the entire, but what it will mean is that it is part of a connected forest landscape where we still see those multiple benefits working together.
I think I would just add, yeah, I mean, I think if you had told me 20 years ago that we'd have an 1,800 acre or a 3,000 acre ceiling, I probably wouldn't have gone to the effort that we've gone to, right? It's community forests to make the kinds of difference that we're hopeful for in our communities. They need to be in that tens of thousands of acres kind of scale. So that's why we're really kind of trying to push the conversation of scale. And
Jay, I might add, I think there's a huge opportunity because if you have a number of community forest level projects that kind of happen one at a time over several years, next thing you know, you've got landscape scale conservation if they're all successful and coming online at 1,000 acres or 500 acres here or there. I know of a ton of examples across the country where it's like 1 loan a year, 2 loans a year. Next thing you know, you look back on a decade's worth of interim finance and you've conserved a landscape or a view shed, right? So I think there's a huge opportunity for community forest scale projects in interim finance and acceleration of the outcomes.
Great. Totally agree. More questions? Any questions online? Everybody just wants to go home? Okay, yeah.
Place to face investment. And so Forest Service, I mean, I think you're all familiar with the programs that we manage. Community forestry is one of them. Forest Legacy is another, but we have a whole suite of other landowner and community assistance type programs that we could. It kind of, I see community forestry program as an intersection of all of those. And so we're trying to be more intentional about how we deliver our programs in a place-based way where we're leveraging investments so that we are having landscape scale. And so I would just maybe challenge this group to help us move in that direction and be more intentional about how we're focusing and delivering, right, our investments.
Any other final thoughts or questions? Okay, with that said, I really want to thank our panelists. I found that very stimulating. Knew it wasn't something we'd resolve today, but the idea was like, who's doing new stuff out there? How are we moving the needle? And I think there were wonderful examples of that on top of all the great stuff that's already happening out there. So if this is something that's of interest to you, please engage with Northwest Community Forest Coalition, track us down. It's going to take all these great minds and more to figure out how we can make more exciting things happen relative to community forest acquisitions. We've had in my area probably, I don't know, Nate, if you know, like maybe 3 or 4 different auctions of land in the 10 to 15,000 acre range. You know, 25 to $30 million deals, none that we can touch or scratch or compete on or move on in 90 days that something's at, you know, auction place. And so, you know, it's like maybe that's the sweet spot that we want to try to get to, and versus those 100,000 acre, 200, $300 million deals. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, well, I just want to jump in. I think what you're saying, these auctions, when they are happening and they are getting more and more expensive and more competitive, I thought Erica's slide on the transaction was super useful. And also just the way that you stacked the financing coming from philanthropy and from different sorts, that's what we're also doing. I think what we need to figure out is how all of us can work together to make those projects happen. And sometimes that happens. It's hard to do when there's a project right in front of you that's closing in 90 days. So I think there's like still sort of a collaborative approach to kind of developing that ease of working together, understanding our different roles and the waterfall and all of that. I think that would be a great outcome in time.
Just a quick question. I'm so curious. I would love to see an anatomy of a deal, but for all the deals like in the Pacific Northwest, every community forest, how much did it cost? What were all the stacks of capital to get there? And then add on top of that, the ones that were not free money, how was it repaid and how long did it take? And what were the implications of that in terms of, we had to make some tough trade-offs to do it, but we got it done, or we didn't get it done, we defaulted and there's a consequence. But if you could look at every single one, I think that would be really interesting. I mean, that's backwards looking, not forwards looking in terms of new creative models, but it'd be really interesting to do that and then start looking at, okay, and what are the sources that the little table I had there was, said high, small or large amounts of capital available, but not at all, you know, real numbers. And so I just think that would be very interesting to start looking at if it doesn't exist. But that's the question, I guess, is does something look like that other than anecdotes, but like a full comprehensive?
Thank you, Spencer.
I think there still is kind of that gap though, that like you can do 100 acres and you can do 10,000 acres, but when we were trying to do 1,500 acres to add on or 2,000 acres, like we weren't big enough for the conservation fund. They talked about it, but couldn't make it work. And so, and that number was so big to figure out repayment, like that scared us. So there is still that spot between the really simple free 3-year payback, $500,000 and the $10 million project that we need to develop that in the funding community. So, and we talked a lot about Washington. We really need, as a coalition, to work on Oregon. So, yeah, that's why we're here.
Great. Again, thank you. I think you've got a few parting words. Just pass it right back to you, right? But again, thank you, everyone. Oh, we maybe have one more.
I was just gonna plug in on this conversation in case others didn't see, a couple different groups involved in here put on a community forest funding webinar, where a couple different community forests kind of talked through how they got themselves funded. And we have a recording of that I know Daniel had sent out to the coalition, but would just recommend folks check that out. As well as, I know on that webinar, Washington Conservation Action highlighted that they have a tool online that has kind of all the different types of funding sources that you might use for conservation, and you can sort through based on the types of projects that you use. So just wanted to highlight that as well, and put in a plug to come to Northwest Land Camp, where we'll have a lot of really great sessions on funding conservation.
Where is it?
July 10th to 12th in Tacoma, Washington.
Lovely Tacoma, Washington. Thank you, Vanessa.
So real quick, sure we're gonna get to a big round of thank yous. I'll just start by thanking all the sponsors and then everybody involved with this, but then especially to Daniel for coordinating all this. And I've been working with Daniel more and more with community forests over the last 6 months. And I'm sure you all know this, but he's a self-starter and a go-getter. And he's looking at all sorts of different ways to support this work. So thank you, Daniel. You've done a great job.
And that's really all I had to say too, is to thank Daniel and thank everyone else. Well, Jay stole it first, that's fine. And thank the sponsors. You know, I wear a lot of hats. I do a lot of different things, but community forestry are definitely where my heart is. And so I love coming to these. I love watching this grow from 8 people in the gorge to we were at 50 or 55, maybe if you include everybody online. So it's just been really impressive. We're a long ways from the population centers, which makes it awesome. And we all came out here and I got to see a part of the West that I hadn't seen before. It was an awesome experience. And so always come back very inspired. So yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone. Everyone have safe drive back to wherever they are. And yeah, I think that ends for him. I will tell you, we'll need to do this again in a couple of years. If you can find a spot with bike riding, you're more likely to get us because Daniel's in charge. But so you know, I tease. But we, think about where we should all come next and visit, descend upon and learn about. Never too early to start the next forum planning. So what was that?
Olympic minutes left.
We've been to Chimicum.
2018.
2018, yeah. So anyway, thank you all. Have a safe drive.